Buddy. Okay. So let's just start going over the first change, and that's the residential purchase agreement. And this is something that should have taken place a long time ago. Section 3D2, the increased deposit. So no longer is there going to be these paragraphs or sections dedicated towards an increased deposit. So what if you remove contingencies? Maybe there's an agreement that the buyer is going to deposit additional money, things like that. So now we've shortened the form from that perspective, and there is an increased deposit addendum. I'm not going to bother wasting your time going through that. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've come across one residential contract in which anybody has utilized that space. And then the other substantive change, or a substantive change to the RPA, is that the seller payment to buyer's broker, SPBB, is no longer being used. It's been eliminated, as a matter of fact. So if we look at section G, seller payment to cover buyer expenses and costs, there's three sections. G1 is seller credit to buyer. And you can see to the right, it's defined as closing costs. And then section G2, additional seller credit terms, does not include buyer broker compensation. And then this is the section that takes place of the seller payment to buyer's broker. We would check the box in G3, seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate buyer's broker. So this replaces that entire form. And in the body of the contract, there's additional language that, and I'll go over that in a minute, further references this paragraph. But here we're going to just put in the percentage that we want to earn, as we normally would on the SPBB, right? So it's simplified in that manner. But the buyer compensation affirmation, it's really important, and I'm just going to read that. Buyer affirmatively represents that at the time this offer is made, buyer has a written agreement with buyer's broker that is valid, covers the property, and provides for compensation for no less than the amount stated above. If you don't have a valid representation agreement, or if the representation agreement specifies compensation to you that's less than what you inserted in G3, the seller has no obligation to pay that compensation to the buyer's broker. So the compensation inserted in G3 can be equal to or less than the buyer representation agreement that you have with your buyer. If it's greater than, seller has no obligation to pay, and that's stated in the body of the contract, as a matter of fact. And then CAR has taken a different position at section G2, additional seller credit. Well, what can that be used for? Well, maybe you could just say something in lieu of repairs. You could do something like that. But it's also saying it could be used for buy downs. And in my opinion, a buy down is a closing cost. But we can specify it if you are ever unsure as to how you want to spread out any closing costs or compensation the seller's offering back to you. And then remember also, in the event you've negotiated a credit and the credit isn't fully used, you will lose that difference unless you specify specifically in the contract that any unused credit will be applied as a direct reduction in the purchase price of the property. So you must specify that. Otherwise, the buyer could lose the benefit of any credits that you have negotiated. Any question about that? So once again, SPBB is eliminated completely. And then you can see in section G3, it does refer down to section 18A2 and A3. So let's just skip down there. And in the meantime, between what we just reviewed in section 18, there really are no changes that are of any value. And just as I mentioned before, but this reiterates what I said, in section 18A2, buyer representation, seller payment to compensate buyer's broker. Buyer affirmatively represents that buyer at the time this offer is made has a written agreement with buyer's broker that is valid, covers the property, provides for compensation no less than the amount stated in paragraph 3G3. If any representation of I through III is not true, then seller has no obligation to pay buyer's broker. And that's just something I told you before, but again, I wanted to point that out as a matter of fact about the implications if you put more compensation in 3G3 than what you have on your representation agreement. You may not, or the seller will have no obligation to compensate you. And the market has changed dramatically, and the seller may try to enforce something like that. Maybe, maybe not. And then the other thing that's taking place, because CAR wants full transparency, now they're placing the burden on escrow to notify the buyer of the total compensation paid to the buyer's agent. So it's a reaffirmation, and that's something that escrow is going to be obligated to do. And this paragraph, section 19D2, addresses that. Let's just go through that. Excuse me. Escrow holder shall provide to buyer a closing statement or other written documentation disclosing the amount of compensation paid to buyer's broker. Now, typically with a seller, the seller gets a closing statement. It shows the compensation paid to the listing agent and to the buyer's broker. So it's very clear. There's no issue there. But a buyer often does not see that information. They're not going to see the seller's side of a closing statement. So now there's a mandate for escrow to notify the buyer subsequent to the close to validate once again the compensation that you as the buyer's agent are receiving in totality. So there's a couple ways for escrow to do that. They can provide a closing disclosure, assuming the commissions are on the closing disclosure. That's one way to do it. From our perspective, in regards to escrow, we're going to just say that we've confirmed section 3G3, for example, of the RPA. I don't want to re-specify or, once again, restate the amount of money that you as the buyer's agent are earning on a transaction. I see no benefit to us for that. So we want to make it as cloudy as possible. But keep that in mind now. Not every escrow may be aware of this. They're going to be violating their contractual obligation. So I thought I would point that out to you also and be prepared for that. Any questions about that? And that does not change escrow's obligation in any other manner, and nor does it give a specific methodology that escrow must follow to disclose the total amount of compensation paid to the buyer's broker. So quiet here. No questions about that? Okay. And then the signature block. So everybody's, I think, maybe familiar with the representative capacity signature disclosure. It's a separate form that states that if there is a revocable trust, the person that's signing as Richard Moore trustee is always going to sign in that capacity. So this is no different than what we've witnessed on the RPA before. However, what they're doing, they're saying, okay, we recognize in many cases the name of a revocable trust many times is often too long, and it could be any type of an entity, as a matter of fact. So now they're saying under section B2, we would specify in B2 the full entity name, whatever it is, to the extent of whatever length it is. So it could be the Moore Family Trust, dated, whatever it is. So it's pretty long, as a matter of fact. But now they're saying, okay, under section B3, if you abbreviate the name of the trust, that's okay. So under print a name of buyer, if it's a trust buying the property, you can just say the Moore Family Trust. You don't have to specify the entire name there, as a matter of fact. So for contractual purposes, that is satisfactory. And then for the sellers also, it's identical. And keep in mind, if there's a buyer and seller, we have a purchase contract that's executed and they've completed these areas satisfactorily, you don't have to use an RCSD, a representative capacity signature disclosure. This will suffice. Now, in a listing contract, there are similar signature blocks, but if a seller signs a listing contract completing this because it's an entity seller, is that sufficient for a future transaction? Possibly not, because you're not going to give a buyer a copy of the listing contract. Any questions about that? That's pretty simple, huh? Let's see. And then the buyer representation broker compensation agreement. Not a lot of changes to it, as a matter of fact. Made things easier for the buyer. So under section B1, you could say you can easily exclude a single family residence. I don't know why they've added that to the document, as a matter of fact, but they have. Why do we want to do that? And then section E1, to the right, it says, or see attached broker created compensation schedule. In case you're looking for it in the Zip Forms library, there is no compensation schedule available in the Zip Forms library. So you would have to make your own, right? If you would wish to charge based upon certain milestones or selling prices. And then section F, cancellation rights and notices. So for a non-exclusive representation agreement, unless you change the time frame regards to cancellation, then they can just send you a cancellation notice and it's effective. For an exclusive agreement, no longer can a termination period exceed, you can't require more than a 30-day notification period to terminate an exclusive agreement. I don't know why that's in here. I'm not aware of that being something required by statute, but that's what they have chosen to do here. And then G2, this is something that was in the past contract. I would gloss over this if I'm speaking to a buyer. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. So in the event the buyer checks that box, or you check that box, and you make an offer, and the seller refuses to pay the compensation that's being requested to pay you as the buyer's agent, if the buyer doesn't have the money and this box is checked, then you're going to earn nothing. So why would we ever do something like that? And not only that, there is a way to then terminate the buyer representation agreement, because we don't want to continue representation or take that liability for a transaction for which we're not being compensated.
Well, if they didn't accept it, that means it's not accepted, right? If they counter that out.
They may counter that out, but the buyer may want the property. And the buyer says, sorry, Carlos, I don't have the money to pay you, but I want to go forward. I'm going to accept that counter.
How can they accept that without you as the agent? Would you that's when you step away?
Yeah, that's when, exactly. Create a non-agency form and cancellation of the buyer representation agreement.
And then would you just have the listing agent follow through with it?
That's up to them.
So you're not involved.
We're going to terminate our relationship with the buyer if that takes place. So I've had at least one example in here in which somebody did sign a representation agreement and that box was checked because the buyer refused to proceed without that box being checked. So it will happen, but just keep that in mind. You may not earn anything. Then a couple of things that seems to be standard among a lot of the forms, the continuation of right to compensation for broker properties. So if we go back up to the form, I'm sorry about that. So section E3, continued right to payment for broker involved properties, or upon the expiration, if we were to insert a time frame in here, say, for example, the continuation period shall be 90 days, we are protected for any transactions that may have occurred associated with buyers that we've introduced to the property, right? So keep that in mind. So it's just similar to a listing contract. Now, however, in the event we're past the expiration of the buyer representation agreement, we want to, if it's going to expire, even with addendums extending that buyer representation agreement, if we want to protect ourselves for any buyers that we've introduced to that property, then we need to, prior to the expiration, submit a list of those buyers. In the event we're canceling this, or properties, excuse me, in the event we're canceling it, we have 5 days following the cancellation time frame to submit a list of the properties to the buyer to notify them that we're entitled to compensation if they buy one of those properties.
So you're only entitled to compensation up to the 90 days in this example if you provide a list prior to cancellation?
Prior to, that's if it's expiring.
Right.
But if there's a cancellation of the contract, Then you have 5 days following the date of the cancellation to provide a list of the properties that you provided to the buyer.
Can you add it into an addendum?
There's a specific form that's here, but yeah, I don't think it really matters exactly how you do it, just as long as you notify the buyer that these are the properties I introduced you during that period of time, and I'm entitled to compensation, but there is a specific form within the library.
And introduced means showed or submitted offers on behalf.
Well, it specifies that. So remember, if it's an exclusive agreement, it doesn't matter what it is. You just want to send those properties in a sense. But if it's a non-exclusive agreement, it talks about broker involvement. Shown the property virtually. I don't know how many people are doing that at this point in time. Maybe you submitted an offer, for example, or you provided a market analysis on the property. So those are aspects that you will have to document to show that you're entitled to compensation for that list of properties. Has anyone even gotten into that ever? I'm just curious. No.
Well, Sonia just did, but after it expired, I asked her to send her client a list of all the properties she showed her,
I see.
not knowing that
Yeah.
you have to do it prior to the expiration.
Yeah.
She thought she was going to renew it. That's why.
I see. And then you can see the signature block is identical to that of the purchase contract and to the listing contract also, in terms of the entities. And then not that we're ever going to do this, but let's see. In the event we are going to cancel a buyer representation agreement, there is a separate form for that. And I guess we may not want to cancel the representation agreement, but often a buyer may want to. So we probably may have an obligation to assist them with that. And you can see it can be unilateral cancellation or not, or mutual cancellation. It talks about the scope of the cancellation. And then you can see in section C2A, the buyer representation agreement remains in effect for all properties covered by this agreement. Or C2B, this refers specifically to the aspect that the buyer lacks the ability to pay you, especially knowing that the seller has now refused to pay the compensation requested in the purchase contract. So it gives us that ability to do that. And also in section E2, you can ask for expenses incurred to be reimbursed, so on and so forth. Good luck getting that. And then signature blocks for mutual cancellation or unilateral cancellation. I don't see this form being used very often, but I wanted to make sure that you're aware of that. And this we very well we may use this form as a matter of fact. Modification of terms, buyer representation agreement. So we can change the expiration date of the representation agreement. Keep in mind, if it's an individual with whom you have a representation agreement signed, the original contract can't exceed 3 months, nor can each extension exceed 3 months. And if it does, then it's invalid. And if it's an LLC, partnership, or entity, then an extension or contract term beyond 3 months is acceptable. And why would we want to use this? Well, it's possible. Let's assume that we have a 3% buyer representation agreement signed, and the seller comes back and says, well, I don't want to pay 2%. So you can modify the representation agreement simply for that property. You may want to use this just to make that transaction happen. So that could be a valid reason why you would like to do that. Or you can change the compensation for a specific property. Matter of fact. So quiet.
Quick question again.
Yeah.
What would be appropriate documentation to say that I've showed you this property if the agreement has been canceled or expired? And so what would I submit? What would be sufficient?
Well, it could be as simple as an email saying, here's a property address. And usually when you do show a property, unless it's an open house, you're probably going to be logging in. So you have some kind of documentation that you showed that property.
Okay.
Or, I think just notifying them of the property that they saw or that you took them to is more than sufficient, at least to cause them to give consideration to the fact that they may want to breach the agreement with you,
Okay.
and you're going to enforce that.
Okay.
And then transfer buyer representation agreement. This form is here. If we want to assign our interest in a representation agreement to another agent, I don't know why we'd ever want to do that. And then the property showing and representation agreement. We've had this before. There's a very few limited changes. But now it will allow us to add more than 3 properties if we wish to do that. And then you can see the amount of compensation that hasn't changed. And then section B3, we're adding the continuation period. So we can specify a time frame subsequent to the expiration to protect ourselves for any of these properties that we had shown. And remember, if it's not a exclusive agreement, you're going to have to have done something that's substantive, showing the property, video tour, something to that effect. And it gives us exactly examples of what would be acceptable documentation or work that we have performed to be entitled to the compensation for a transaction. And then once again, these forms are very consistent. If you're going to provide a list of properties, in this case, it should be very apparent, right? Because we listed the properties, but you need to notify them prior to the expiration with the list of properties. And if it's a cancellation, you have 5 days following the cancellation to give them a list of the properties which you believe you're entitled to compensation to. Any questions about that? Okay. And the listing contract, section C1, you can see the words broker created compensation schedule. They put this in here. As I told you, there is no such thing in the zip forms library, so keep that in mind. And then section E2, publication of seller willingness to consider concessions. If the sellers, and I don't know, has anyone come across this, is willing to offer concessions? Are you seeing that anywhere in the MLS? Probably not. Why? Just let them make an offer. And I wouldn't even address this in the listing contract, because I would just tell my seller that you should expect the buyer to ask you, Mr. Seller, to pay the buyer's agent's compensation. But if you're going to even make mention of compensation or concessions, they need to check the box in words as to where they will permit that to be offered, as a matter of fact. And in no way can you mention that it can be used for commissions or compensation. And one thing I wanted to mention, I think there's a lot of confusion, especially if we have listings that are registered and we're going to be marketing them at a later date. So if we have a contract that's effective today, but we're not going to market it until January 1st, we actually have to register that property. We also have to fill out or complete the form MLSA, which is part of the residential lease agreement, to specify the start marketing date. So that's very important. And then public marketing of property. In the event you start marketing a property and if it's not currently on the MLS, within 1 business day of marketing their property, you actually have to register that with the multiple listing service, and it must be in an active status. So keep that in mind. And I wanted to talk about the clear cooperation policy. So in the event, in my example, we have a listing contract that's effective today. We're going to start marketing it January 1st. If you look at section D2, seller instructs broker to begin marketing the property to the public on, in our case, January 1st, 2025. So if we have a contract, once again, effective today, we start marketing on January 1st, we have to register that property with the multiple listing service. In the event you don't register it with a 2-day time frame of the effective date of the listing contract, it's a $2,500 fine. So we want to avoid that. No questions about that? Okay.
So when you register, it's not going active, is it just inputting the information on the MLS?
It's not on the MLS. It's under the listing toolbox on the main screen. When you go to CRMLS, there's a separate icon for you to register the property, and it's 5 bits of information, as a matter of fact.
And it's not shared with anyone other than the MLS.
Yeah, actually, unfortunately, it doesn't interact with the multiple listing service. But when you register a listing and you're going to convert it to an active listing, you then have to go into that registered listing and convert it. If you put a sign up or something like that, that's marketing. You can distribute registered listings to anybody associated with the same broker or broker's license. So that's perfectly acceptable. You can distribute information to somebody with whom you have assigned agency disclosure also.
What about if they got an offer before marketing and everything?
I'm sorry, what was that?
If the property is not registered yet, but they got an offer already before it goes to the market and let's say January 31st is when they're gonna be, first it's gonna be marketing.
Mhm.
So I had a listing right now, but they wanna they offer money already before I start marketing.
You can do that if you have a registered listing and you're talking to a buyer and they have signed an agency disclosure with you, then you can introduce that property to them. You can't put it on Facebook. You can't do anything like that. And if you do it within one business day, you have to actually make it an active listing.
Yeah.
So that's the advantage of a registered listing. Not only that, if it's registered, you can actually show the property too. Whereas under a coming soon status, which is an active status, you cannot show the property.
Well,
So is it limited to only the listing agent's clients or anyone in the brokerage?
Anyone in the brokerage.
So coming soon is registered, not active.
No, there's different statuses. Registered is a status per se, but it's not on the MLS. It's a separate portal to just notify the MLS that you have an active listing contract. So when you look at the listing contract, on the third line, there's a beginning date. And the beginning date is the effective date of the contract, meaning if you have it effective as of today, and somebody brings a buyer, you're protected. But if your beginning date is January 1st, and the seller and a buyer comes forward right now, today, makes an offer, you're not entitled to any compensation. So the whole benefit would be to get the listing contract with effective date of today. You're not going to market it for another month, as a matter of fact, thank you. And then, which is fine, but you're still protected, which is, most critical. My cold is getting the man. Any questions about that? Yeah. All right.
Richard, I have a question.
What's that?
In sometimes the buyers, they place a picture that, my house is going to come for sale on Facebook, like let's say in a community page or something. Would that
Yeah.
put the agent in violation?
I would say yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, actually, within one business day of any marketing, the agent's going to have an obligation to place that on the MLS.
I see. Okay, thank you.
So if you have another agent that's watching, that could be a problem for the existing listing agent.
That's right.
It's not marketing. Yeah. That would be my approach to protect yourself instead of getting a fine or having to try to defend yourself, because that doesn't matter anyways. If the property is being marketed, CRMLS doesn't care. They're not going to listen to excuses that, oh, I didn't do it. It was my seller that did it. I don't think they really care, as a matter of fact. And then the seller property questionnaire. Section 6K talks about wood balcony inspections. So beginning January 1st of this year, we are required to have properties with 3 more units inspected in the event there's a balcony of 6 feet or higher supported by a wood structure. That's been postponed for 1 year. Just wanted to mention that to you. But I'll go through the wood balcony addendum as a matter of fact. But one other thing I wanted to mention is I know a number of you work with investors, and this is something that's critical. Under section 7F, the question is whether you purchase a property within 18 months of accepting an offer to sell it. So many investors are going to buy it, they're going to rehab it and sell it before 18 months. So if that's the case, the seller has the obligation to notify or provide disclosure of anyone who performed work in the job in excess of $1,000, provide copies of the building permits. In addition to that, if they don't have permits for any of the work that was performed in excess of $1,000, they have to provide the complete contact information for the contractor, whoever performed the work. So if you're working with investors, my thought would be that you would like to notify them and say, you may give consideration to getting permits for everything you're doing, as opposed to not. Yeah, you might save a little bit of money, but the disclosures themselves could be very awkward, as a matter of fact. So that's something to keep in mind. And then this is the wooden balconies and stairs addendum, something we just briefly talked about. So at this point in time, no inspection is required, but as of January 1st of 2026, if the property is 3 or more units and there's an upstairs unit supported by wooden beams, something to that effect, there's a balcony, you will be required to have the property inspected no matter what. And if in the event there are repairs that are required and they're not completed, you have to disclose that. But if there are repairs that are required, as a matter of fact, or because it's deemed to be unhealthy or critical to somebody's health, maybe it's going to fall apart, I think I would suggest having those repairs completed.
There's a question.
What's that?
How far back do you go for work done on the property?
How far back do you go for work done on the property? In terms of,
18 months, right? Is that?
well, for the seller property questionnaire, if there's a from the date of the close of the time they acquired it through the date of the offer. If we're talking about when they must provide all the documentation as to the work completed.
It sounds
And the
like they're
names of the
saying how far
contractors?
back of the work being completed, like, but it's only if it's sold within 18 months.
Yeah, it's
right?
only
The
if
purchase.
if you bought the
Purchase.
property and sold it again within 18 months. Correct. So how far back do you go back in regards to work completed? I don't think there's any time frame. If you're concerned about disclosure, you should just mention everything that's taken place. But you may not have the obligation to disclose the name of every single contractor and provide the permits for the work that have been completed. So that's the difference.
Yeah, so if you're selling it within 6 months or a year, then you go back a year, right, of anyone that you hired. So it's, if you bought it and then you sell it a year later,
Uh-huh.
so,
Everybody that's worked on the property.
right, within
Yeah.
that year that you own the property.
Yeah.
So it just goes back as far as you purchased it.
Yes, and from the time that you own it, exactly. But of course, if you, pardon me?
Not before.
Well, if you have information that you think is critical to a buyer, you should disclose that, even if you weren't involved with it.
Okay.
And then the counteroffers, that has changed. There's been a number of other documents that have changed, but I don't think it's of any value to us, as a matter of fact, really. So a couple of things. When I look at section 1A, and this is nothing new, 1A, 1B, and 1C. So these are not new aspects of the counteroffer. But in the event you have a purchase contract and not all parties to the purchase contract have initialed the optional paragraphs, meaning liquidated damages and the arbitration clause, your contract is not complete. So what you need to do, even if there's no changes to the contract in terms of price, terms, so on and so forth, you should issue a counteroffer. Section 1A addresses that. So if we don't care if we include those paragraphs, we would just sign the counteroffer. And in section 1A, it indicates that those items will be excluded from the purchase contract. It's either that or we issue the counteroffer, and those we can mention that those items are to be included into the purchase contract. And then something else that I've witnessed, you may see this with escrow from time to time, section 1B. Unless otherwise agreed or altered in another counteroffer, down payment and loan amounts will be adjusted in the same proportion as in the original offer. So if we went from $1 million to $2 million of down payment and a loan amount, well, if the loan amount was $800,000, it's always going to be an 80% loan to value. However, the earnest money deposit does not change. So whatever the contract read unless that was countered, the earnest money deposit specified in the original offer will always remain. And you had one example in which there's an appraisal gap. Did Johnny do that?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, he submitted an offer on a property that I think was 1,600,000, 1,500,000, 1,600,000. Anyway, they submitted an offer at 1,460,000, but the appraisal had to come in at 1,430,000 or something, 39 or something like that.
So we
For the
might make an
report.
offer for $2 million, but maybe we don't want to concern the seller and we say it just has to appraise at 1,500,000. So that difference is called the appraisal gap. So if the price goes up to 2,500,000, it just has to appraise at 2 million, whatever that appraisal, we deduct the appraisal gap.
So that gap moves no
It
matter.
moves, it's right, it's fixed. Whatever the difference is between the initial appraisal and the offer price, that will always be used in the future. And then, so now we've had another signature block added to all of the counter offers. So in the event the buyer or the seller issues a counter offer and the buyer signs the counter offer and it's after the expiration date, now this will require the seller to sign that counter offer one more time and return it back to the buyer. But the seller has 3 more days following the date of the buyer's signature. So I'm the seller, I issued a counter offer and it expired today. The buyer signs it today, returns it. Now, realistically, the seller has to approve that by signing this form. You can see it in red. If the seller doesn't, then we don't have an accepted offer. I think it's so often we watched counter offers expiring or purchase contracts expiring. So it's never been an issue. But I think what you need to keep in mind, you should give consideration, especially if you're the seller, in the event there are outstanding contracts sitting out there, you should probably give consideration to withdrawing something before you accept somebody else's offer. So if the seller signs, let's go on to this. If the seller signs his counteroffer before the buyer responds, you should withdraw the counteroffer. But more importantly, if it's a buyer counteroffer, let's just pull that up. And I'm going to go back to a paragraph just before, as a matter of fact. In terms of expiration, I want to point this out. The buyer counteroffer shall be deemed revoked and the deposits of any shall be returned unless by 5 p.m. of the 3rd day after the date the buyer counteroffer is signed. It is signed in paragraph 4 by seller, or if the buyer withdraws this buyer counteroffer at any time prior to seller's acceptance. So in essence, and this is nothing new to anybody, if in the event the buyer signs and the seller allows it to lapse, and the seller signs 10 days later, the buyer is going to have to sign once again under late acceptance to validate the contract. Nothing new there. And then the seller multiple counteroffer has similar aspects. So in a seller multiple counteroffer, the seller is required to sign in section 5, buyer is required to sign in section 7, and the seller must sign one more time in section 8. But if there's late acceptance, if the seller signs section 8 and it's after the expiration, the buyer is now going to have to sign section 9. Everybody's bored to death.
Rich, in what situation would someone leave a deposit while they're in counters?
Would they leave a deposit?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, on the buyer counteroffer,
Uh-huh.
it said that in the event if there's any deposits that they're
Well, we have had aggressive escrows and escrow instructions, and the buyers have wired their money.
during counters.
Yeah, because they thought that they had an accepted offer. Yes. So anyways. So that's my discussion today. Any questions? No? Okay.
Excuse me, I have a question. So the way I understand it, even if the counter offer is more than the offer price, the loan amount wouldn't change. The loan amount would change, but the earnest money wouldn't. Am
That
I
is correct. Correct.
Okay.
So the loan to value will remain constant. And the earnest money deposit remains constant. If you are offered $30,000, no matter what percentage it was, it will still be $30,000. Well, has everybody turned in their cards?
I got my name. Here comes all the cards.
I know. It's funny that that's in here, right?
Oh my God. I had that portable bandage in that, when you can put it right there.
Did you put one in?
Do you want, wait, I have one of mine, just right up, wait.
Just so you win,
This
huh?
is Twice. I tried it too. Put your name on there. I love to do it.